The boots came down hard on the concrete before Miles Rowan even had time to raise his hands. Three of Damian Cross's men, not security guards in any real sense, more like enforcers in company jackets, had him pinned against the hood of a company SUV in the parking structure beneath Ashcroft Global's headquarters. No warning, no explanation, just a fist to the kidney that dropped him to one knee, then a knee to the ribs that put him on the ground. "Where is he?" Damien crouched down, his voice quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "Last time I asked politely." Miles spat blood onto the painted concrete. His daughter's school photo was still folded in his breast pocket. He'd been meaning to frame it. He didn't answer. The next blow came fast. If you've never seen a man take a beating and refuse to make a sound, you don't forget it when you finally do. And if you want to find out what Miles Rowan said when they were done, and what walked out of that garage afterward, stay with us. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. This one doesn't end the way anyone expects. 8 months before anyone put a hand on him, Miles Rowan was invisible, which was exactly how he preferred it. He drove. That was the job. He arrived early, kept the Lincoln clean, held the door, and kept his mouth shut. Celeste Ashcroft was not a woman who hired staff to make conversation with her. She hired them to be efficient, reliable, and forgettable. Miles understood this without being told. He'd learned to read rooms quickly, a skill developed across a decade of jobs that never quite worked out, a divorce that hollowed him out for a full year, and the slow, unglamorous work of becoming the kind of father his daughter actually needed rather than the kind he'd imagined being. I was good at the job. Not passionate about it. Nobody with a functioning soul is passionate about ferrying rich people to meetings. But good, punctual, discreet. He knew every alternate route through downtown, knew which parking structures had the lowest clearance, so he'd never have to back the Lincoln out in front of an impatient executive, knew that Celeste took her coffee at exactly the temperature that most people would call lukewarm and called it wrong. He didn't know anything about her family. He made a point of not knowing. That changed on a Tuesday in October when the Lincoln started running rough. It wasn't dramatic. A slight hesitation on acceleration, a vibration in the steering column that shouldn't have been there on a vehicle maintained to those standards. Miles noted it after the morning drop-off and pulled into the underground garage at Ashcroft headquarters to run a quick check before the afternoon schedule. The Lincoln was a 1987 Continental, one of the last of its generation, kept original by Celeste's explicit instruction. She'd made clear during his onboarding that the car was not to be altered, not detailed by outside services, and not driven by anyone except Miles. He'd assumed sentiment. Old money families were strange about things like that. He popped the hood, got under it, found nothing obvious, checked the fuel line, checked the distributor cap. Then, because the vibration had felt like it was coming from somewhere beneath the dash, he slid into the passenger footwell with a flashlight and started feeling along the underside of the dashboard. His fingers found it before his eyes did. Small, magnetic, tucked into a bracket behind the fuse panel where a person wouldn't find it unless they were looking, or unless they happened to be lying on their back in the dark with a flashlight and nothing better to do. A tracking device. Miles lay still for a moment. The garage was quiet. Somewhere in the structure a car door echoed. He thought, carefully, about what to do next. He put it back exactly where he found it. He finished the inspection, found that the actual cause of the vibration was a loose heat shield on the exhaust, a 5-minute fix, and had the car ready for the afternoon pickup without mentioning any of it to anyone. He drove Celeste to 3 meetings and a dinner reservation and delivered her back to her building at 9:14 p.m., and the whole time he thought about that device and who had put it there and whether it was monitoring the car's location or something else. He told himself it wasn't his business. He lasted 4 days. The photograph turns up the following Saturday. Miles had a habit, developed out of simple professional pride, of vacuuming the Lincoln's interior himself rather than running it through the fleet service. The fleet guys were fine, but they used a commercial nozzle that was too aggressive on the old leather piping along the seat seams. One popped seam on a 40-year-old Continental was not something you fix cheaply. He was running the vacuum along the rear seat when the nozzle caught on something in the gap between the seat cushion and the backrest. He turned off the vacuum, reached in, pulled out a photograph. It was old. Not antique old, but worn. The kind of worn that comes from being handled repeatedly over a long period of time. The image showed two men standing in front of what appeared to be an aircraft hangar, squinting into direct sun. One of them was young, maybe 30, in work clothes. The other was older, heavier, wearing a jacket Miles didn't recognize. He would have set it aside without a second thought, except for one detail. The younger man in the photograph was standing next to a car, a specific car. A 1987 Lincoln Continental, dark blue, with a particular chrome trim detail on the C-pillar that Miles had spent 40 minutes polishing the previous week. This car. The same car. Miles turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that had been pressed hard into the paper, check the manual, page 47. Don't tell her. But he almost didn't do it. He sat in his apartment that night with the photograph on the kitchen table and a glass of water he kept forgetting to drink, and ran through the reasonable explanations. Someone had left the photo by accident. It was a coincidence. It was old and had been in the car for years, fallen into the seat gap. No significance. The message on the back was meant for someone else, years ago, and had simply never been acted on. He picked up the phone and called his daughter. She was 11 and lived with her mother in a house 40 minutes north that Miles was still paying down his share of the mortgage on, despite not having lived there in 3 years. She told him about a girl at school who had said something unkind, and he listened and gave advice that he wasn't sure was good, but that was honest, and said goodnight. He sat with the silence after the call ended. Then he went out to the parking garage where the Lincoln sat under its cover and found the owner's manual in the glove box. Page 47 was not a standard page. The manual was original, a thick-bound document from 1987, and the actual page 47 covered the power steering system. But someone had glued a paper pocket to the inside back of that page, thin, almost invisible unless you held the manual up to the light. And inside the pocket was a folded slip of paper no larger than an index card. On it was written a set of GPS coordinates and 4 words. He didn't die. Hurry. Well, Miles was not, by nature, an impulsive person. His ex-wife had told him more than once, with varying degrees of frustration, that he processed too slowly, that he needed to think something through from 6 angles before he'd commit to a direction. She wasn't wrong. He'd spent the better part of his 30s thinking carefully through decisions that other people just made, and he'd arrived at 43 with a moderately successful track record of not blowing things up catastrophically, which he considered a reasonable if uninspiring outcome. He looked up the coordinates. They pointed to an industrial area about 22 miles outside the city. Not a neighborhood most people drove to by choice. The map showed a cluster of old commercial buildings, a rail spur that hadn't been active in years, and what appeared to be a cluster of repair shops or light manufacturing. He sat with that for 3 days. He drove Celeste. He watched the tracking device. He said nothing. On the 4th day, a Thursday, he drove out to the coordinates on his day off. What? He almost missed the place. It registered on the map as an unnamed parcel, the kind of lot that shows up as gray on satellite view because it hasn't been photographed recently enough to update. In person, it was a low building with a corrugated metal facade, 3 roll-up bay doors, and a sign that had been painted over badly enough that you could still read the ghost of the original lettering, Ashcroft Mechanical, Eastine, 1971. Miles sat in his personal car across the street for about 10 minutes. Nothing moved. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that came not from calm but from vacancy. Buildings left standing past the point where anyone had a reason to maintain them, windows dark, weeds growing up through cracked asphalt. He crossed the street. The side door was unlocked. Inside, the smell of motor oil and old wood and something else, something that took him a moment to identify as cooked food. Recent. A hot plate on a workbench with a small pot on it. "I heard your car," said a voice from the back of the space. Miles turned. The man who stepped out from behind a steel shelving unit was in his mid-60s, probably, though he moved like someone who'd been physically active until recently, and was only now feeling the accumulation of years. He was unshaven. He wore clothes that had been washed too many times in too cold water and gone pale and shapeless. But his eyes were sharp, alert. The kind of eyes that had been watching a door for a long time and had gotten good at evaluating what came through it. Miles had done his research. He'd spent the 3 days between finding the coordinates and driving out here reading everything publicly available about Nathan Ashcroft, founder of Ashcroft Global, father of Celeste Ashcroft, deceased, officially, legally, permanently, following a helicopter crash over open water 3 years ago. No body recovered, estate settled, legacy secured, a foundation established in his name. He was looking at Nathan Ashcroft's face. It matched the photographs, minus 3 years, and whatever those 3 years had cost. "You're him," Miles said. It wasn't a question. "Depends on who you think I am." The man moved toward the workbench slowly. Not threatening, careful. The careful movement of a person who had learned not to make sudden gestures. "Who sent you?" "Nobody. I found the photo. And the coordinates." A long pause. Nathan Ashcroft, Miles couldn't think of him as anyone else, looked at him with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite suspicion. Something in between. "You're the driver. 8 months. How's the Lincoln running?" Miles blinked. Of all the questions available to a man who'd been living in a stripped-out repair shop for an unknown period of time, apparently the condition of the car was pressing. "Fine. There was a loose heat shield." Nathan nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. "She never let them touch that car. I was afraid they'd get into it eventually. There's a tracking device on it behind the fuse panel." That landed. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Damien's people," he said. Not a question. "How long?" "I don't know when they put it there. I found it about a week ago." Nathan moved to a folding chair and sat down in it heavily. Not with drama, with the particular weight of a person absorbing new information on top of an already full load. "Does Celeste know you're here?" "No." "Does anyone know?" "No." Another long pause. In the bay behind them, something shifted. A rat, probably, or a settling of old timber. Miles stood in the oil-smelling air of a garage that bore his employer's family name and looked at a man the entire world had been told was dead and tried to decide whether he was standing inside a situation he could still walk away from. He already knew he couldn't. "You'd better sit down," Nathan said. "This is going to take a while." It took most of the afternoon. Nathan talked slowly and without embellishment, which Miles appreciated. There was no performance in it, no rehearsed quality. Just a man laying out a sequence of events in the order they had occurred, stopping occasionally to correct himself when the timeline blurred or when the emotion of a particular moment threatened to overtake the telling. The short version? 3 years ago, Nathan had uncovered financial evidence suggesting that senior executives at Ashcroft Global had been using a subsidiary network to route funds for a criminal operation whose scope Nathan described, carefully, as larger than the company itself. He had confronted Damien Cross, his head of corporate security, a man he had hired personally, trusted personally, promoted 3 times in 12 years, with the evidence. Damien had told him to give him 48 hours to investigate. What happened 48 hours later was a helicopter that went down over open water in conditions that were unusual but not unheard of. The pilot, who also didn't survive officially, had apparently been briefed on a different flight plan than the one filed. Nathan had survived by luck, a specific and humiliating kind of luck, involving a life jacket he'd put on as a joke because the water below them looked particularly rough, and the particular joke stopped being funny roughly 40 seconds later. He'd been fished out by a fishing boat operated by a man who turned out to be the kind of person who didn't ask questions because he'd had enough dealings with authority in his life to be wary of it. That man, now dead of natural causes, had given Nathan time to think. What Nathan had concluded floating between dead and not dead was that going back to his life meant going back into range of people who had just tried to kill him and would try again. What Nathan had concluded, over the months that followed, was that the only way to survive long enough to expose what he'd found was to stay invisible until he had something more than evidence, until he had a way to make the evidence public so quickly and completely that eliminating him afterward would serve no purpose. What he hadn't found, in 3 years of operating without resources or identity, was that delivery mechanism. "Until you walked in here," he said. Miles rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm a chauffeur. You're the man who drives my daughter to work every morning in a car with hidden documents in it that nobody found for 3 years. Nathan looked at him steadily. "I put everything I had in that car because I knew she'd never let them touch it. And I knew that eventually someone careful would find what I left. I didn't know it would take this long." "What's in the car, beyond what I already found?" Nathan reached behind the shelving unit and produced a manila envelope, thick with folded papers. Copies. The originals are distributed, but the copies are sufficient. He paused. Damien Cross knows I'm alive. He's been looking for me for 18 months. He doesn't know where I am, but he knows I'm not dead, which means he's watching everything adjacent to this company very carefully, including the car, including the driver. Miles looked at the envelope. He thought about his daughter and the girl at school who'd said something unkind, and the mortgage he was still paying, and the small pleasures of an honest job performed carefully. He thought about the tracking device behind the fuse panel and what it meant that someone had put it there and how long they'd been watching. He thought about a man living alone in an abandoned garage because the alternative was dying, and the 3 years that represented, and what it cost to survive something like that without becoming someone unrecognizable. "What do you need?" Miles said. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then, "Right now? Now? Someone who can bring me food that isn't from a can." He almost smiled, almost. "The rest we figure out as we go." Miles drove back to the city in the early evening, through the long orange light that comes at that hour in autumn, with the manila envelope in his jacket and the coordinates memorized and the tracking device location. Memorized and Damien Cross's name memorized, and a new, uncomfortable, entirely unwelcome clarity about what the next phase of his life was going to require. He stopped at a grocery store. He bought soup, bread, a good piece of chicken, and coffee that wasn't terrible. He thought about how to get it back to the garage without being followed, and concluded he'd need to switch vehicles, and started working out the logistics of that in the methodical, 6 angles at once way that his ex-wife had found so frustrating, and that was right now the only quality he possessed that seemed genuinely useful. He did not think about walking away. That window had closed somewhere around the moment he'd looked at Nathan Ashcroft's eyes and understood what 3 years of surviving in the dark looked like on a human face. Some things you see and can't unsee. Some burdens get handed to you so cleanly that refusing them feels like a choice you aren't actually capable of making. Miles Rowan had spent 8 months being invisible in someone else's story. He drove home through the city lights with the quiet certainty that invisibility, for better or worse, was no longer an option. The chicken was still warm when Miles got back to the garage the second time. He'd taken his personal car, a 10-year-old Civic with a dented rear quarter panel and 60-something thousand miles on it, and parked it 3 blocks from the industrial lot before walking the rest of the way in the dark. He didn't know if that was sufficient precaution. He didn't know what sufficient precaution looked like when the person you were trying to avoid employed an entire security division. But it was what he had. Nathan was where Miles had left him, seated at the workbench with a battery-powered lamp that threw a low yellow light across the space. He was reading something, a folded newspaper, old enough that the creases had gone soft. And he set it down without comment when Miles came through the side door. "You came back," Nathan said. "I said I would." People say a lot of things. Miles set the bag on the workbench and started unpacking it. The soup in its sealed container, the bread, the chicken wrapped in paper from the deli counter, the coffee in a thermos he'd filled at home because the garage-adjacent convenience store had the worst coffee he'd encountered outside of a hospital waiting room. Nathan watched this without speaking. When Miles pushed the container of soup toward him, Nathan opened it and ate without ceremony, standing at the workbench, which told Miles something about how the last 3 years had reshaped the man's relationship to things like sitting down for meals. They didn't talk while Nathan ate. That was fine. Miles had brought a folding stool from the back of his car, and he sat on it and drank his own coffee and listened to the buildings settle around them. Outside, somewhere distant, a freight train moved through the rail spur at the edge of the property with a low, sustained sound that vibrated in the floor. When Nathan finished, he wrapped the chicken bones in the paper from the deli and set it aside and looked at Miles with the particular directness of a man who had spent too long talking to no one and had, as a result, lost patience for preamble. "How much do you know about Ashcroft Global's structure?" he asked. "What a driver knows." "Which isn't much." "More than you think, probably. You've been in that building for 8 months. You've driven Celeste to every significant meeting on her schedule. You hear things. Even when people treat you like furniture, you hear things." Miles turned that over. He'd never thought of it that way, but it wasn't wrong. The things he'd absorbed simply by being in the car, names, locations, the texture of conversations that weren't meant for him, had accumulated into something more substantial than he'd realized. He said, I know the board has been pushing Celeste on a merger, something international. She's been resisting it. The Hargrove deal. That's the name I've heard. Nathan's expression shifted. Not surprise, recognition, the kind that carries weight. Hargrove Capital is not a capital firm, not in any meaningful sense. It's a shell architecture that Damien and Elaine Mercer built over 7 years to process funds that the company couldn't run through its own books. He paused. Elaine is the board strategist. She came in 4 years before the crash. I hired her. That's on me. What kind of funds? Nathan was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that precedes something a person has had to get comfortable saying out loud because the weight of not saying it had become unsustainable. The operation I uncovered moved money for a network that operated across 6 countries. The activities varied by location. Some was fraud, some was procurement of things that shouldn't be procured, some was influence buying at a level that would have ended careers and sent people to federal prison if it had come out. He looked at his hands. I had a company that employed 14,000 people. I had a legacy I'd spent 35 years building, and inside it, without my knowledge, or so I told myself, there was this. Or so you told yourself, Miles repeated. Nathan looked up. You said, or so I told myself. A long pause. Nathan didn't look away. There were things I chose not to look at too closely. Over the years, Damien ran security the way I wanted it run, tight, no interference, results. I didn't ask about methods. Elaine ran the board strategy with a precision that made my job easier. I didn't ask who she was talking to outside the company. He exhaled slowly. I'm not telling you I knew. I'm telling you I created conditions where people like that could operate. That's different from knowing, but it's not nothing. Miles had not expected that. He'd expected grievance, a clean narrative of betrayal, which was what the photograph and the coordinates and the dramatic gesture of hiding documents in a car had implied. The complexity was harder to hold. Okay, Miles said. Okay? You're telling me this because you think I need to know it before I decide whether to help you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're walking into. Miles finished his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Tell me about Damien Cross. Damien Cross had come to Ashcroft Global from a private security consultancy, whose clients, Nathan explained, had included 2 foreign governments, one of which had since experienced a change of leadership under circumstances that remained officially unexplained. He was 51, ex-military in the way that certain men were ex-military, not with visible pride, but with a kind of permanently calibrated efficiency that had simply become how he moved through the world. He was not large. It was the opposite of large. He was compact and quiet and entirely comfortable with silence in a way that most people read as calm and that Nathan had come to understand was something else. He's not cruel, Nathan said. That's the important thing to understand. Cruelty requires emotion. Damien doesn't operate that way. He makes assessments. He determines what serves the objective and what threatens it, and he acts accordingly. The helicopter wasn't personal. I was a threat to the operation. He resolved the threat. He tried to kill you. He did kill me, effectively. The fact that I survived is a logistical failure on his part, not a moral one on mine. Nathan said this without bitterness, which was somehow more unsettling than bitterness would have been. He's been looking for me because I'm still a threat, not because he's angry, because I'm unresolved. And if he finds you, he'll resolve it. Miles set his empty thermos on the workbench. What about Celeste? Nathan was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the freight train outside made another pass, though that wasn't possible. What Miles heard was the echo of the first one bouncing off the far side of the building. Celeste doesn't know, Nathan said finally. I'm certain of that. Certain how? Because if she knew, she would have done something about it. She's difficult, and she's demanding, and she has her mother's temperament, which is to say, she is not a woman who sits on information. A pause. Also loved me, whatever else she is, and she's complicated, she's always been complicated. She loved me. The past tense sat in the room between them. She thinks you're dead, Miles said. She watched them bury an empty coffin. She gave a eulogy. She restructured the entire company around the reality of my not being in it anymore. Nathan's voice stayed even, but something moved beneath it. She's had 3 years to become someone who functions without me. I don't know if that person is glad I'm alive or furious at me for being alive. Probably both. Probably in that order. Miles started running a second schedule alongside his visible one. The visible schedule was the job. Arrive at Celeste's building at 7:45, drive her to Ashcroft headquarters, wait. Drive her to meetings, wait. Drive her to dinner or home or wherever the afternoon demanded, return the Lincoln to the garage, log the mileage, go home. He did this with the same precision he'd always brought to it, because the alternative, any change in routine, any diminishment of the reliability that made him invisible, would draw attention he couldn't afford. The second schedule happened in the gaps, on his days off, on the occasional long wait between morning drop-off and afternoon pickup, when he had 3 or 4 hours he could account for as personal time. He drove out to the industrial lot in the Civic, always parked 3 blocks away, always walked. He brought food. He brought the information he'd gathered, fragments of overheard conversation, observations about who was meeting with whom, the texture of Celeste's mood across the previous week. Nathan absorbed all of it. He processed information the way Miles suspected he'd always processed it. Quickly, quietly, connecting things that seemed unrelated on the surface and finding the structural logic underneath. The man had built a company from the ground up. Whatever else the last 3 years had done to him, they hadn't taken that. The Hargrove merger meeting, Nathan said one afternoon. What were they pushing for specifically? A signature on a preliminary agreement. Celeste kept asking for more time to review the terms. Elaine Mercer told her the window was closing. Elaine always says the window is closing. It's her primary operating tactic. Nathan stared at the oil-stained floor. What was Celeste's response? She said she'd have an answer by the end of the month. That's 3 weeks. About that. Nathan stood and moved to the far bay where the shell of an old car sat under a tarp. He pulled the tarp back slightly, not revealing the car but feeling along the edge of the frame in a specific way, like a man checking something he'd checked before. Miles had asked about it once. Nathan had said it was a project. He hadn't elaborated, and Miles hadn't pushed. If Celeste signs the preliminary agreement, Nathan said, Elaine's people can move the final merger documents through the board without requiring Celeste's direct approval at each stage. It's a mechanism they built into the bylaws during a governance revision 18 months ago. Celeste may not fully understand its implications. Can she be told without telling her who's telling her? Nathan turned around. What do you mean? If I could get information about the bylaw mechanism to someone who could raise it with her as outside counsel or as a regulatory concern, something that delays the signature without pointing back to either of us. Nathan looked at him for a moment with an expression that was neither surprise nor approval, but something more considered than either. You've been thinking about this. I think about logistics. It's what I do. There's an attorney named Priya Solis, Nathan said. She worked for the company 10 years ago before a falling out with the board over compliance issues. She's been in private practice since then. She's principled to a fault, and she's disliked by everyone at Ashcroft, which means she has no reason to cooperate with them, and would have every reason to raise a flag if she received credible information about a governance irregularity. How do I reach her without it being traceable? Carefully, Nathan said. Very carefully. The tracking device behind the fuse panel continued to bother Miles. He'd left it in place because removing it would signal that he'd found it, and that was worse than being tracked. But he'd begun running mental calculations on what the device actually told whoever was monitoring it. The Lincoln went from Celeste's building to Ashcroft headquarters to various locations around the city and back. Miles's personal car, the Civic, was not on anyone's radar because it was his personal vehicle and nobody had thought to tag it. He assumed. He'd started checking the Civic every time he reached it, running his hands along the wheel wells and under the bumpers and anywhere a magnetic device might find purchase. He'd found nothing. He found nothing 11 times, which did not make him confident, only more aware of the limits of what he could find by feel. The paranoia was rational, which made it worse than the irrational kind. On a Wednesday in mid-November, Damien Cross was in the car. Not unusual by itself, Damien occasionally rode with Celeste to external meetings, particularly board-related events. But he didn't usually sit in the front passenger seat, and he didn't usually angle himself toward the driver, and he didn't usually make conversation. 8 months, Damien said. He wasn't looking at Miles. He was looking at the road ahead, through the windshield, as if the statement were directed at the general environment. About that, Miles said. Good record. Before us, you were with a transport company. Small outfit. Before that, independently contracted. A pause. You also had a shop, classic car restoration. Ran it for 6 years. Miles kept his eyes on the road. His hands on the wheel were exactly where they always were. Had to close it. Capital issues. That happens. Damien's tone was the tone of someone discussing weather. What do you miss about it? The question was wrong. Not the content of it, but the act of asking it. Damien Cross did not engage in small talk, and this had the shape of small talk with something underneath it. Miles thought about his answer for exactly as long as it would take a person who wasn't alarmed to think about it. The work itself, Miles said. There's something satisfying about taking something that doesn't run and making it run, finding the problem, solving it. Damien nodded slowly, not at the answer, at something else. You're good with the Lincoln. It's a good car. Nathan Ashcroft loved that car. He said it without inflection. Nathan Ashcroft, the name of a dead man, dropped into the car's air like any other name. Celeste keeps it for sentimental reasons. Understandable. Sure, Miles said. Silence. The city moved past the windows. Miles tracked the distance to the next turn and the position of vehicles around him with the automatic attention of a person who has driven professionally long enough that road awareness has moved out of the conscious mind entirely. You have a daughter, Damien said. There it was. Miles had known it was coming, some version of it, from the moment Damien had gotten in the front seat. It still landed like something cold. 11 years old, Miles said, steady, even. Lives with her mom. Good age, Damien said. He didn't look at Miles when he said it, and he didn't say anything else, and the rest of the drive to the meeting location was quiet. But the silence after that comment was not the same quality of silence as the silence before it. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that contains a message. Miles delivered Celeste and Damien to the meeting, pulled the Lincoln to the designated waiting area, and sat behind the wheel for a moment with his hands in his lap and his heart doing something uncomfortable. Then he pulled out his phone and called his daughter's mother. Hey, he said when she picked up. Is everything okay there? Yeah, why? No reason, just checking in. A pause. Can you maybe keep Sophie close for the next couple of weeks? Don't let her walk home from school. I'll explain later. A silence on the other end that he understood completely, having put it there. Miles, what's going on? Nothing I can explain right now. I just need you to trust me on this one. She didn't say she trusted him. She said she'd pick Sophie up herself until he explained what was happening. That was fair. That was in fact better than trust. Miles put the phone away and sat in the Lincoln in the parking structure and breathed. Through the windshield, a water stain on the concrete ceiling above him had the vague outline of something he couldn't identify, which seemed appropriate. 3 weeks became 2 weeks became 10 days. Miles met with Priya Solis once, in a coffee shop far from anything associated with Ashcroft Global, through an introduction arranged by Nathan, through a chain of intermediaries that Miles preferred not to think too hard about. Priya was a small woman in her mid-50s with quick eyes and the manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of people trying to mislead her and had gotten very good at knowing when it was happening. She listened to what Miles told her, carefully, without the full context, only the governance mechanism and the merger timeline. And she asked 3 questions and then was quiet for a moment and then said, Someone else is going to raise this if I don't. You know that. I'd rather you raise it, Miles said, because whoever you're working for can't. I'm not working for anyone. She looked at him over her coffee cup. Sure, she said, in the tone of a person who has stopped arguing points they've already won. She raised the flag. It landed in Celeste's inbox as a letter on firm letterhead, citing the specific bylaw mechanism and requesting a review before any preliminary agreement was signed. Celeste, according to what Miles was able to observe over the following days, did not dismiss it. She read it twice in the back of the Lincoln. Miles watched in the rearview mirror with the peripheral attention he'd developed. And something shifted in the quality of her attention after that. She was quieter. She asked fewer questions in meetings and listened more carefully to the answers. The merger timeline pushed back by a week. Then another. Elaine Mercer, who Miles had encountered only at a distance, but whose name had become as familiar as a headache, called Celeste twice in one afternoon. Both calls taken in the back of the Lincoln, both kept short by Celeste in a way that communicated something without saying it. On the second call, Celeste said, "I'm aware of the bylaw question, Elaine. I'm having it reviewed. That's what responsible governance looks like." A pause. Miles couldn't hear Elaine's response. "No," Celeste said. "I'm not moving the timeline until I understand what I'm signing." She ended the call and said nothing else. Miles drove. The city went by. He filed the exchange in the part of his mind where he was storing everything, the growing weight of it, the way it was starting to feel like carrying something he hadn't been designed to carry for this long. He told Nathan that night. Nathan listened without interrupting, which was one of the qualities Miles had come to rely on. When Miles finished, Nathan was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw its yellow light across the workbench and the stacks of folded papers that had become, over the past 3 weeks, something that looked like an organized archive. Nathan had been working with the copies from the envelope, organizing them into a sequence that would make sense to someone who hadn't spent 3 years inside the story. "She's smarter than they planned for," Nathan said. "She's always been smart." "Yes, but smart people can still be managed if the information environment around them is controlled carefully enough." He paused. "They've controlled her information environment for 3 years. Every person in that inner circle was vetted by Damien. Every piece of data she received about the company's external relationships went through channels he or Elaine had access to." Nathan touched one of the folded documents. "She's been operating inside a version of reality they constructed. The fact that she's slowing down on the merger suggests something is starting to feel wrong to her. She just doesn't know what." "What happens when she does know?" Miles said. "That's the question." Nathan looked at the lamp. "She's going to be angry. At Damien and Elaine, obviously, but also at me." "For faking your death?" "For being the person who built the company that made all of this possible. For hiring the people who did this. For not seeing it sooner." He exhaled. "And for being alive while she went through 3 years of grief without me." The last part was the part that had the most weight in it. Miles recognized that. He recognized it because he knew something about the specific damage done by absences that can't be explained cleanly. His daughter had been 8 when the marriage ended, and there were still moments in her face, occasional and unpredictable, where he saw the residue of the adjustment she'd had to make. It wasn't accusation. It was just the mark that time leaves on a person who had to reorganize themselves around a loss. Celeste Ashcroft had reorganized herself around the loss of her father. Nathan walking back into that reorganization was not going to be simple, regardless of how righteous the reason for it was. "She'll work through it," Miles said, because it seemed important to say something. "I know," Nathan said. "She comes from people who work through things." He almost smiled. Not quite. Her mother was the same way. Difficult and stubborn, and ultimately more durable than anyone gave her credit for. Miles stood up and stretched his back, which had been bothering him since Tuesday. He was 43 and he'd been driving professionally since his 30s, and the lower back was the first thing to register any extended period of stress. He picked up the thermos and the empty food containers. He did the small housekeeping of the visit, the way he always did, because leaving the space clean felt like the only form of order he could actually impose on any of this. "Damien mentioned my daughter," Miles said. He'd been holding that for last. Not because it was the most important thing, but because saying it out loud made it more real, and he'd needed the rest of the conversation before he was ready for it to be real. Nathan went still. "When?" 3 days ago, in the car. He went through my background, the transport work, the shop. Then he said he knew I had a daughter, just dropped it in and moved on. He was telling you he has leverage. I know what he was doing. Miles, I already called her mother. Sophie's being picked up from school. It's handled for now." He looked at Nathan steadily. "But I'm not going to be able to hold this together indefinitely. Whatever you're building toward with those documents, however you're planning to deploy it, we need to start thinking about when." Nathan looked at the archive on the workbench. The organized evidence of 3 years of invisible survival and careful preparation, waiting for the moment that was either coming or not. "I know," he said. "I know we do." Miles nodded. He picked up his bag and moved toward the side door. Behind him, the lamp threw Nathan's shadow long across the floor, and the old building settled again in the dark, and somewhere outside the freight line ran its quiet thunder through the ground and kept going. The call came at 5:47 in the morning. Miles was already awake. He'd been awake since 4, lying in the dark with the particular wakefulness that isn't rest and isn't sleep, but something in between that leaves a person more tired than either. His phone was on the nightstand, and when it lit up, he saw Nathan's number, which was a prepaid phone Nathan had been using, and he picked up before the second ring. "They found me," Nathan said. No preamble, no context. Just those 3 words in a voice that was steady, in the way that voices get steady when a person has moved past fear into something more functional. Miles was sitting up before the sentence ended. "How long ago?" "An hour, maybe more. A car drove the perimeter of the block twice. Didn't stop. Plates were clean, too clean, rental fleet clean. Did they see you?" "I don't know. I was in the back bay. The windows in front are boarded." A pause. "I moved the documents." "Where?" "Somewhere they won't find in a quick search. I need you to come." Miles was already pulling on his jeans. "I can be there in 40 minutes. Don't use the regular route." And Miles, a pause that lasted just long enough to have weight. "Come to the garage, not the side door, the bay doors." He understood what that meant without Nathan explaining it. The side door was discreet. The bay doors faced the street. If Nathan wanted him at the bay doors, he was planning something visible. Miles wasn't sure that was wise, but Nathan Ashcroft had survived 3 years in circumstances that would have ended most people, and Miles had learned over the preceding weeks to extend the man a certain operational credibility, even when the plan made him nervous. 40 minutes, Miles said, and hung up. Whoa. He took 4 different turns he didn't need to take, and doubled back twice, and watched his mirrors with the focused attention of someone who now understood, in a way he hadn't 6 weeks ago, that being watched and knowing you're being watched were 2 different problems requiring different responses. He didn't see a tail. He didn't feel like that was conclusive. The industrial lot looked the same as it always looked in the early morning, gray and quiet, and slightly less abandoned than it actually was. Miles pulled the Civic to its usual 3-block spot, then changed his mind and moved it 2 blocks in the opposite direction, then got out and walked, hands in his jacket pockets, taking the long way around the perimeter of the block, the way Nathan had described the surveillance car doing. He saw it on his second pass. A dark sedan parked at the far end of the adjacent street, not running, not obviously occupied, but positioned with a sightline to the main approach of the lot. Miles walked past it without slowing down or looking directly at it, which took more discipline than he'd expected because everything in him wanted to look. He went around the back of the block and came through a break in a chain-link fence he'd identified weeks ago and entered the garage through a rear access panel that Nathan had shown him. Inside, the space felt different than it usually did, tighter. Nathan had moved things, the shelving unit repositioned, the folding tables cleared, the lamp relocated to the far bay. The covered car in the back bay had its tarp pulled off completely for the first time. Miles stopped when he saw it. It was the Lincoln. Not Celeste's Lincoln, but another one. An identical year and model, same dark blue, same chrome trim detail on the C-pillar. It was in significantly worse shape than Celeste's car. Surface rust on the rear quarter panels, a cracked taillight, interior stripped down to the frame in places. But the bones were there, and Nathan had been working on it in the months of his invisible survival, and it was further along than the disassembled state in which Miles had first glimpsed it would have suggested. "You've been restoring it," Miles said. Nathan was at the workbench, dressed and alert in a way that suggested he hadn't slept. "It was here when I found this place, left by whoever closed the shop in 1994. Same year as Celeste's, near enough." He looked at the car without sentiment. "I needed something to do with my hands." "Does it run?" "Started it last week for the first time. Rough, but it runs." Miles pulled his attention from the car back to the immediate problem. "There's a sedan on the adjacent street. Clean plates. It has a sightline to the front approach." "I know. There'll be more. Damien doesn't send one car." Nathan moved away from the workbench and stood in the middle of the bay floor with his arms at his sides, looking at the bay doors. They were the large roll-up type, industrial, operated by a manual chain. "He's going to move soon. I've run out of time for a gradual approach." "Nathan, if they come in here, they're going to come in here. That's already decided." He turned and looked at Miles directly. "The question is whether they come in on their terms or mine." Miles looked at him. "At the garage. At the restored Lincoln that shouldn't have been able to run but apparently did." He felt the shape of what Nathan was describing, and it scared him in the particular way that things scare you when you understand them well enough to see all the ways they could go wrong. "You want to walk out the front," Miles said. "I want to drive out the front." "Nathan, Damien's people need a situation they can contain quietly. A man found hiding in an abandoned garage. That's containable. A man who walks out publicly, in front of witnesses, in a car his entire company would recognize. That's a different situation." He said it calmly. The calm of a person who has spent a long time arriving at a decision and is no longer second-guessing it. "I need you here. I need someone Celeste trusts, someone she'll recognize as part of her own world, present when this happens." "She doesn't trust me. I'm her driver." "She trusts you more than you know." 8 months, no incidents, no complaints, no drama. For Celeste, that's the closest thing to trust she extends to most people in her professional life. He paused. "I need you to call her." "And tell her what?" "Tell her there's something wrong with the car, and you need her to come to the garage personally." "She's not going to come to a garage in an industrial lot at 6 in the morning because her driver called. Tell her it's about her father." The words landed flat and final in the garage air. Miles looked at Nathan and understood that the decision had been made before the phone call this morning, possibly before last night, possibly days ago. The sedan on the adjacent street had simply moved the timeline up. "If I call her," Miles said slowly, "Damien's people will know. Her phone is monitored. It has to be." "Yes." "So calling her is the same as telling Damien we're here." "They already know we're here. The call confirms it. But it also confirms that Celeste is coming, which means Damien can't move quietly once she arrives." Nathan's jaw tightened. "He won't hurt her. She's the CEO. She's the legitimate authority structure of the company. Even Damien needs that intact." Miles thought about Damien Cross sitting in the front passenger seat of the Lincoln and saying his daughter's name with the casual precision of a man inserting a knife and not turning it, just leaving it there. He thought about Priya Solis raising the governance flag and the merger timeline shifting, and Elaine Mercer's 2 phone calls in one afternoon, and the accumulation of small pressures over weeks that had been building towards something. He thought about his daughter being picked up from school and not knowing why. He called Celeste. She picked up on the 3rd ring, which told him she was already awake. Her voice had the quality it carried during high-stress periods. Not uncontrolled, but compressed, the way water sounds when pressure narrows the pipe. "Rowan, it's not 7 yet." "I know. I'm sorry to call at this hour." He'd decided on the way here that he wasn't going to be anything other than direct. Indirect wasn't going to work with Celeste Ashcroft. "I need you to come to an address I'm going to give you. Now, this morning, before your regular schedule." A short silence. "What address? Why?" "It's about your father." The silence that followed was different, longer, denser. Miles had expected a sharp response, some version of "What are you talking about?" or "My father is dead." Instead, Celeste said nothing for long enough that he checked the phone to confirm the call was still connected. "Ms. Ashcroft, where?" Her voice had changed, dropped to something quieter. Not softer, the opposite of softer. The voice of a person whose body has just redirected all available resources toward a single point. Miles gave her the address. "Come alone," he said, "or as close to alone as you can manage." "Rowan." A pause. "Is this real?" "Yes." Another silence. Then, 20 minutes. She made it in 17. Damien's people moved first. Miles heard them before he saw them. The particular sound of multiple vehicle doors opening and closing in coordinated sequence. The kind of sound that has a different quality than ordinary parking lot activity. He was standing near the side door when it happened. Nathan was in the back bay, next to the Lincoln. The documents, wherever Nathan had moved them, were not on the premises, which was the one thing Miles felt certain about. 3 men came through the side door. 2 more appeared at the boarded front windows, not entering but visible through the gap between boards. All 5 were in Ashcroft Global Security uniforms, not the lobby security who checked badges and smiled at employees, but the operational arm that Miles had seen occasionally in the building's lower levels, the ones who wore their uniforms like a specific kind of statement. Damien Cross came in last. Through the side door, behind his people, with the unhurried pace of a man who had already decided how this was going to conclude. "Mr. Rowan," he said. His voice in the garage had the same quality it had in the Lincoln 3 days ago. Flat, conversational, unhurried. "You've been busy." Miles didn't answer. Damien looked around the space. His eyes moved over it with professional efficiency, cataloging exits, noting the covered workbench, the lamp, the cleared bay floor, the Lincoln in the back. His expression when he saw the Lincoln was the only moment where something shifted briefly behind his eyes. Then it was gone. "Where are they?" He wasn't talking about the documents. He was talking about Nathan. "I'd like to know what the charge is," Miles said. "If you're arresting someone, there should be a charge." "We're not the police." "I know." Damien looked at him, the look of a man revising an assessment slightly upward. "You've done something stupid and loyal, Mr. Rowan, which is the most dangerous combination of things a person in your position can do." He moved forward, and the two men behind him moved with him. "Step aside." Miles didn't move. What happened next was quick and impersonal, which was in its way worse than if it had been angry. One of the men took him by the collar and put him against the nearest support pillar with enough force to knock the air out of him, and then the other one hit him twice. Body shots, professional, not trying to injure him badly, but trying to make him manageable, which they did. Miles went down onto one knee. His vision went briefly white and then gray, and then resolved back into the interior of the garage and the sound of his own breathing, which was labored. He didn't make a sound. He wasn't sure if that was pride or shock or some combination of both, but he stayed quiet and stayed on his knee and did not give them what they were looking for, which was information, which was movement toward the back bay, which was any indication of where Nathan was or where the documents had gone. The cameras, he thought. The building had old security cameras, non-functional by any normal assessment, but Nathan had rigged one of them 2 weeks ago with a battery-powered recorder Miles had brought. It was filming. If the footage survived, it was filming. Damien stood in front of him and looked down at him with an expression that Miles could only describe as administrative. "Last chance to make this easier," he said. Miles looked up at him. His ribs hurt. His back was against the pillar. Behind Damien, the two men stood with the posture of people waiting for direction, and beyond them the other three were spreading through the garage, checking behind shelving units, lifting tarp corners, moving with the systematic quality of a search. "Go to hell," Miles said. Damien's expression didn't change. He turned away. The sound that stopped everything came from the back bay, an engine turning over, the particular sound of a large V8 finding its idle, rough at first, then settling into a low rolling rumble that moved through the concrete floor and up through the pillar Miles was leaning against and into the bones of everyone standing in that space. Every person in the garage went still. The chain on the bay door mechanism engaged. The big roll-up door began to move, slowly, with the protesting sound of a mechanism that hadn't been operated in years, grinding and complaining but moving. Light came in from the bottom first, the gray early morning light of a November street, and then more light as the door rose, and then the silhouette of the Lincoln's hood, and then the whole car, moving forward at walking pace, until it crossed the threshold of the garage and stopped in the pale morning outside. The driver's door opened. Nathan Ashcroft stepped out of the car. He stood in the street in front of his company's security force and looked at them with the expression of a man who has had 3 years to decide what he wanted this moment to look like and had decided on something quieter than dramatic. Damien Cross had gone absolutely still. The administrative quality of his face had, for the first time in Miles's observation of him, simply stopped working. "Damien," Nathan said, his voice carried well in the morning quiet. "Step away from my driver." Or just say, "Yeah." The 5 seconds that followed had the strange, stretched quality of a moment where multiple people are simultaneously revising their understanding of reality. One of the men near Miles actually stepped back, not by decision, by reflex. The body responding to information before the mind had finished processing it. Damien was the exception. Damien didn't step back. He turned to face Nathan with the deliberate movement of a person managing their response very carefully, and what Miles saw on his face in that moment was not panic, it was calculation. Even now, with Nathan standing alive in the morning light in front of his own security force, Damien Cross was running assessments. "Nathan," he said. The first name. Not Sir, not Mr. Ashcroft. The familiar address of a man claiming a relationship, reminding the other person that they had one. "You look well." "I look like I've been living in a machine shop for the better part of a year," Nathan said, which is what happens when your head of security stages your death. He hadn't moved from beside the car door. He didn't need to move. His stillness was doing enough. "How long did you plan it?" "Before the helicopter. I want to know how long you were running this alongside your legitimate work before you decided I was more useful dead." "This isn't the place for that conversation." "This is exactly the place." Nathan moved then, not toward Damien but toward the side of the car, one hand resting on the roof. "Because you're standing in front of cameras. At least one of them is functional, so everything you're doing right now is being recorded. If you move against me or against my driver in the next 60 seconds, that footage goes to people you don't want to have it." Damien's calculation ran. Miles could watch it happening. The assessment of whether the camera claim was real, whether Nathan had the means to distribute the footage, whether the logistics of the threat held up. "You've been planning this for a while," Damien said. "I've had time." A car turned onto the street from the far end. Miles, still on one knee against the pillar, his ribs were very unhappy, and he was making an effort not to show how unhappy, recognized the sound of the engine before the car itself was visible. A company car. A newer sedan, Ashcroft Fleet charcoal gray. Celeste Ashcroft got out while it was still rolling. She must have been 10 feet from Nathan before she stopped. The car door was still open behind her. She was in the clothes she'd have been putting on when Miles called. Professional, dark jacket, a woman who had been about to be a CEO for another day. Her face, when it settled on Nathan, went through several things very quickly and arrived at something that wasn't any single emotion, but all of them happening at the same time. "Dad," she said. It wasn't loud. It barely carried to where Miles was, still on the ground, watching. Nathan looked at his daughter with an expression that Miles couldn't have described and wouldn't have tried to. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. The word sounded raw, like something kept in a closed space too long. Celeste took one more step toward him and stopped again. Miles watched her jaw work. "You're alive." "I'm alive." "For 3..." She stopped, started again. "3 years." "I know." "You let me..." Her voice fractured on it. Not broke, fractured. A controlled break, a Celeste Ashcroft kind of break, where the structure held but the crack was visible. "I gave a eulogy." "I know, I'm sorry." The word sorry sat in the morning air between them, and it was clearly not enough, and Nathan knew it was not enough, and didn't try to make it more. Damien moved. Not a large movement, a shift of his weight toward his nearest man, the beginning of a communication, a direction about to be issued. Miles saw it from the ground and said, loudly enough to carry, "The camera's been running since they came through the door, Ms. Ashcroft. All 5 of them, including when they put me against the pillar." Celeste turned. She looked at Miles on the ground, really looked at him, the way she rarely looked at the people who worked for her, with full attention. And then she looked at Damien Cross. Her face, which had been fractured a moment ago, restructured itself into something entirely different. "Don't," she said to Damien. The word was quiet and absolute. The voice of a person who ran a multi-billion-dollar company and had been doing it competently for 3 years under false pretenses, and had just discovered the full shape of the deception. "Do not move. Do not give any instruction. Do not make this worse." Damien looked at her. The calculation was still running. "Celeste, you don't have the full picture. I have enough." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked at her 2 personal security staff who had followed her from the car. "Call legal. Call the board chair. Call the number on my phone labeled Federal. Don't ask me why it's there. Just call it." She turned back to Damien. "And someone help my driver off the floor." Chum. Miles accepted the help because his ribs had made a decision about what they would and wouldn't permit, and getting off the floor unassisted was apparently not on the permitted list. He got up, slowly, with one of Celeste's security staff supporting his arm, and stood against the pillar for a moment while the world confirmed that it was going to stay in one place. Nathan had moved to Celeste. They were standing close together but not touching, 2 people on opposite sides of 3 years of separate survival, not sure yet how to close the distance physically. Miles watched them talk in low voices and felt distinctly that he was witnessing something private, and looked away. Damien's men had stopped moving. Damien himself stood in the center of the garage floor with the stillness of someone who had completed his assessment and arrived at an outcome he hadn't planned for and was now very carefully not doing anything that would worsen his position, the moment for what it was. He had not gotten where he was by being stupid. "The documents aren't here," Nathan said, loudly enough for Damien to hear. He'd returned from his conversation with Celeste, and he addressed the room in the tone of a man concluding a meeting. "What you're looking for isn't on the premises. It's distributed, multiple copies, multiple custodians, none of them connected to me or to Miles directly. If anything happens to either of us or to anyone associated with us, those documents go to federal investigators, to the press, and to the 3 board members who are not part of this." A pause. "I've had 3 years, Damien. I've been patient, and I've been careful, and I've been thorough. Don't make me prove how thorough." Damien looked at him for a long moment. "You've changed," he said. "Living in a machine shop for a year does that." Miles, who had moved to stand beside the Lincoln, close enough to touch the car's roof, which he found himself doing, one hand flat against the cool metal, watched Damien Cross make the final calculation. The math of a cornered man with a very good mind running through every remaining option and finding each one worse than the last. Damien unclenched his hands. He turned to his people. "Stand down," he said quietly. Nobody moved for a moment. Then, one by one, they did. The morning extended itself into something longer and more complicated than mornings usually are. Celeste's legal team arrived first. Then, with remarkable speed given the hour, 2 men in federal credentials who identified themselves only partially to everyone present and asked the remaining security personnel to wait outside, which they did. Miles gave a statement to one of them that took 40 minutes and covered everything from the tracking device to the photograph to the coordinates to Damien's visit to the front seat of the Lincoln 3 weeks ago. He was sitting on a folding chair near the bay door during most of this. His ribs had been looked at briefly by a medic who'd arrived with one of the federal vehicles. Nothing broken, 2 cracked at most, which the medic described as something Miles would feel strongly for about 3 weeks, and then would just feel occasionally for the remainder of his natural life. "Lucky," the medic said. "Sure," Miles said. He watched, from the folding chair, as Nathan spent an hour in conversation with the federal agents in the far corner of the garage. He watched Celeste move between her legal team and her phone, and the agents with the focused efficiency of a person who processes shock by converting it immediately into action, which was, Miles thought, probably the only way she knew how to survive it. She came to him once during a pause. She stood in front of him with her hands at her sides and looked at him with the expression of a person who has too many things to say and hasn't yet organized them. "How long did you know?" she asked. "About 7 weeks. And you kept driving me. It was still the job." She was quiet for a moment. "They hit you." "I've had worse." He hadn't particularly, but it seemed like the right thing to say. "The camera," she said. "The functional one. How did you know it was running?" "I set it up 2 weeks ago. Your father showed me where to position it." Celeste looked toward where Nathan was standing with the agents. Something moved across her face that Miles recognized as grief, in the particular form it takes when you're not yet ready to experience it fully and are storing it for later. "He told you things," she said. Not accusatory, factual. "He did. Things he hasn't told me yet. Some of them," Miles said carefully, "he'll need time to figure out how to tell you. Some of them are about him, not just about what they did to him." She looked at Miles for a moment. "You're not just a driver," she said. "I am, actually, just a driver." He shifted carefully on the chair because the ribs objected to stillness as much as they objected to movement. "I was just the person who happened to find what he left in the car." "That's not nothing." "No," Miles agreed. "That's not nothing." She went back to her team. Miles watched the morning settle around the garage, the light coming in through the open bay door, the Lincoln sitting half in and half out of the space with its engine now quiet, the dust motes moving in the air the way they always moved in old buildings, regardless of what was happening at human level. Nathan, from across the garage, caught his eye. He gave Miles a slight nod. The kind of nod that doesn't mean everything is fine, because everything was not fine and would not be fine for a long time. The kind that means we did what needed doing and it held together enough to matter. Miles nodded back. He put his head back against the pillar and breathed carefully around his ribs, and watched the light move across the concrete floor of the garage, where Nathan Ashcroft had spent a year restoring a car with his hands, while the world continued to function on the premise that he was dead. And he thought about the particular stubbornness it took to stay alive, when staying alive was the only form of resistance available to you. It wasn't elegant. None of it had been elegant. There were 1,000 points at which things could have gone differently and worse, and some of them had almost gone that way. And the version of events where Miles was not sitting in this chair but somewhere considerably less comfortable, or not sitting anywhere at all, was close enough to feel real. But the door was open, the car was outside, the man was standing in the light. For now, that was enough. The federal agents took Damian Cross into custody at 9:17 that morning, which was 46 minutes after Nathan walked out of the garage and roughly 3 hours before anyone at Ashcroft Global's headquarters understood what was happening. The custody was quiet. No cuffs in the street, no cameras rolling, no scene. Damian walked to the vehicle with the same unhurried composure he'd carried into the garage, and Miles, watching from the bay door with his hand pressed against his ribs, found himself thinking that a man like that probably went through every phase of his life with the same quality of controlled attention: breakfast, assassination attempts, federal arrest, all processed with the same administrative calm. It was the most frightening thing about him, and it remained frightening even now that it was directed at the inside of an unmarked vehicle instead of at Miles's continued existence. Celeste watched the car leave from beside the Lincoln. She didn't say anything. She had the look of a person running a very large calculation with insufficient sleep and too many variables, which Miles had come to recognize over 8 months as her baseline operational state. Only now the variables were not quarterly projections and governance structures, but the fact that her father was standing 12 feet away from her, alive, in clothes that had been washed too many times. Nathan watched the vehicle leave too. Then he turned to Celeste and said, "We need to talk about the shareholder meeting." She looked at him. "Dad, you just walked out of a garage after 3 years." "I know. Can we possibly—" "Elaine Mercer is in that building right now," Nathan said. Not unkindly. Factual, the way he was always factual. "She doesn't know what happened here this morning. She's going to find out within the next few hours. And when she does, she's going to move. The merger documents, the board authorizations, the financial transfer mechanisms she's been building toward. She will try to execute whatever she can before anyone stops her." Celeste stared at him for a moment. The fractured quality that Miles had seen in her face when she first arrived had not disappeared, just been placed somewhere load-bearing, the way a person puts something valuable on a high shelf during a crisis to deal with later. "How do you know her timeline?" she asked. "Because I know how she thinks. I hired her. I spent 4 years watching her work." He paused. "The shareholder meeting is this afternoon." "I know when the shareholder meeting is." "Then you know we have about 5 hours. Celeste turned and looked at one of her legal team who was standing at a respectful distance with a phone in each hand and the expression of a man who had accepted that this morning was beyond any category of professional experience he'd prepared for. "Get me everything on the Hargrove merger package. Every document, every board authorization, every communication thread. I want it on the table in the conference room when I arrive." She turned back to her father. "You're coming with me." "I'll need to stop somewhere first." "Of course you will," she said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it, the kind of response that comes from a shared history too old to be entirely erased by 3 years of grief. She looked at Miles. "Rowan, can you drive?" Miles considered his ribs. They were going to have opinions about everything he did today and for the next 3 weeks. "Yes," he said. "Then let's go." The something first stop was a storage unit 12 miles from the garage, operated by a facility that Nathan had arranged through the same chain of intermediaries that had connected Miles to Priya Solis. The unit contained the original documents, not copies, not fragments, but the complete physical archive Nathan had been assembling before the helicopter and had partially managed to secure in the 48 hours between confronting Damian and the crash. The rest had been reconstructed from memory, from secondary sources, from the slow, painstaking work of a man alone in a machine shop with nothing but time and the contents of his own head. It took 2 large accordion folders to carry everything. Miles put them in the trunk of Celeste's car, the company sedan, not the Lincoln, because the Lincoln was currently being treated as evidence and nobody was driving it anywhere until someone with a federal badge said otherwise. He looked at this trunk closing over those folders and thought about the photograph in the Lincoln seat cushion and the coordinates on the index card and the 8 months he'd spent invisible in a car full of secrets without knowing it. He got behind the wheel. Nathan got in the back. Celeste was already on the phone. "She's stalling the board," she said to someone. Her general counsel, Miles guessed, from context. "Tell them the CEO is on her way and the meeting doesn't start without me. Use whatever language you need to." A pause. "I don't care if that's not how it's done. That's how it's being done today." She ended the call. The car was quiet for a moment except for the sound of city traffic and Miles navigating through it, and Nathan opening one of the accordion folders and beginning, quietly, to sort through its contents in a way that suggested he'd done it many times. "The financial transfer mechanism," Nathan said from the back seat. "Elaine built it across 3 board authorizations. The third one uses Celeste's signature." Celeste turned in her seat. "I never signed anything for Hargrove." "Not directly. It was embedded in the governance revision 18 months ago, the one that restructured emergency board authority." He found the document he was looking for and held it toward her. "Page 11, subsection 4C. It looks like standard emergency protocol language." "It isn't." Celeste took the page. Miles watched her read it in the rearview mirror. Her expression moved through concentration into something harder. "I read this," she said quietly. "I read this and I signed it. The language was designed to be read as something else. Elaine's very good at that." Nathan said it without absolution, not to make Celeste feel worse, but because it was accurate. The subsection gives the board authority to execute a merger agreement on the CEO's behalf during a declared period of operational necessity, with a threshold of only 3 board votes instead of the usual full board majority. And Elaine controls 3 votes. She's controlled 3 votes since she arrived. Celeste set the page down on her knee. Miles could see in the mirror the particular expression of someone absorbing the precise dimensions of how they've been used and finding those dimensions worse than they'd imagined. She was quiet for a full minute. "The other board members," she said finally, "the ones not involved, do they know what they've been part of?" Some suspected something was wrong. None of them knew the full scope. Nathan closed the folder. "That's what we're giving them today. The full scope." The Ashcroft Global Shareholder Meeting was held in the company's main building, on the 34th floor, in a conference space that had been designed for exactly this kind of occasion. Long table, high windows, the particular formal atmosphere that signals the occasion requires a person's best behavior. Miles had driven Celeste to this floor 6 times in 8 months. He knew the parking structure, the lobby security, the elevator bank that accessed the meeting floors directly. What he didn't know, and what he discovered when they arrived at 11:47 with 13 minutes before the scheduled start, was that Elaine Mercer had moved up the timeline. The information came from Celeste's assistant, who met them at the elevator with the compressed urgency of someone delivering news they know is bad. "She convened a preliminary session at 11:30, the assistant said. "She's calling it a pre-meeting administrative review. 3 board members, the Hargrove representatives, and the executive team." Celeste stepped out of the elevator without breaking stride. "Who authorized a preliminary session?" She cited the emergency protocol provision. Of course she did. Celeste looked at her general counsel, who had materialized from somewhere and was keeping pace beside her. Can she execute anything in a preliminary session? If she frames it correctly and gets the signature she needs, she could argue the preliminary session constitutes the operational necessity trigger. It's aggressive. It probably wouldn't survive a court challenge. But by the time a challenge was mounted, the transfer would have moved. How far along is she? We don't know. They were moving through the hallway now. Celeste, her counsel, Nathan, with the accordion folders, Miles carrying the second one, because someone had to, 2 of Celeste's security personnel who had reorganized themselves around the new reality of the morning with admirable professional flexibility. The hallway had that particular high-floor quiet that comes from good insulation and the expectation of important events. Nathan said, from beside Miles, quietly enough that only Miles could hear. "Damien isn't here to manage the physical situation. Elaine is smart, but she works through process, not force. If we get into that room, she can't do anything he would have done." Is that supposed to be reassuring? It's supposed to be accurate. Miles adjusted his grip on the accordion folder. His ribs had been sending complaints up through the management chain for the past hour, and the chain was running out of ways to respond. He breathed carefully and kept walking. Celeste pushed open the doors to the conference room. Elaine Mercer was at the head of the table. She was 60, or close to it, with silver hair worn short and the polished, utterly calibrated presentation of a woman who had spent decades in rooms like this one and had made herself indispensable in every single one of them. She had the Hargrove representatives, 2 men in expensive suits, cautious eyes, on her right, and 3 board members on her left, and a stack of documents in front of her that had the look of something nearly completed. The expression she produced when the doors opened was remarkable in its steadiness. A slight adjustment, nothing more. The expression of someone who has encountered an unexpected variable and is already reprocessing. "Celeste," she said. Her eyes moved to Nathan. The expression adjusted again. A fractional shift, contained, controlled. The eyes of someone who has received catastrophic information and chosen not to display it. And I'm sorry. I'm not sure I... Yes, you are, Nathan said. The room was very quiet. The 2 Hargrove representatives exchanged a look. One of the 3 board members, Gerald Fitch, who Miles knew by sight from 6 months of watching him arrive at meetings, went pale in the specific way that middle-aged men go pale when reality reorganizes itself without asking their permission. Celeste set the accordion folder on the table, not aggressively, precisely. She placed it where everyone at the table could see it and said, "The preliminary session is suspended. This document package contains evidence of a criminal operation running through Ashcroft Global's subsidiary network for at least 7 years, the staged death of the company's founder, the illegal imprisonment and identity erasure of a living person, and the deliberate manipulation of board authorization structures to facilitate a fraudulent merger." She looked at Elaine. "That's the short version." Elaine looked back at her. The calculation behind her eyes was different from Damien's calculation. More political, more concerned with narrative, less concerned with exits. "Celeste, I understand you're overwhelmed. This morning has clearly been—" "Don't," Nathan said. He moved to the table and stood beside Celeste. "I know what you're about to do. I've watched you do it in 20 different rooms. You're going to reframe and contextualize and find the language that makes the person you're talking to feel like the unreasonable one. It won't work today." He looked at her with something that wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was the assessment of a man who had spent 3 years in a machine shop with her choices as company. "You're very good, Elaine. You always were. I want you to know that I'm aware of exactly how good you are and that it still wasn't enough." Elaine looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the folder on the table. Then she looked at the 2 Hargrove representatives who were now sitting with the posture of men who have decided their most urgent priority is the quality of their legal representation. She did not say anything else. The next 4 hours were not dramatic in the way that movies make things dramatic. They were complicated and procedural and frequently exhausting. 2 more federal agents arrived at 12:30, which Miles assumed had been coordinated by whoever Celeste's assistant had called that morning from the garage using the number labeled Federal. A forensic accounting team materialized by 2 o'clock. The 3 board members, Fitch and 2 others, spent most of the afternoon in a separate room with their individual counsel, a process Miles understood as people determining how much they'd known and how to characterize what they'd known as something other than what it was. Miles spent most of this in a chair outside the conference room. His accordion folder had been taken from him with a receipt, which he found darkly funny. He sat with his back against the wall and his ribs against his will and watched the hallway traffic of lawyers and federal personnel and Ashcroft corporate staff, who were clearly aware that something significant was happening and were processing it according to their individual relationships with uncertainty. Nathan came out once, around 1:30, and sat in the chair beside him. He looked tired in a way that the morning's adrenaline had been suppressing and was no longer sufficient to suppress. "How's it going in there?" Miles asked. "Slowly, which is how it should go." Nathan loosened the collar of the shirt he was wearing, which was the least appropriate shirt for a shareholder meeting in a major corporation's history, and which he was wearing because it was what he'd had in the garage. "The Hargrove people are cooperating. They know which way the wind is." "And Elaine?" "Quiet, which is scarier than when she talks, in my experience." I was quiet for a moment. She'll have counsel by tonight. She'll have very good counsel by tomorrow. What we have is substantial, but substantial doesn't mean fast. How long? Investigation could take 6 months, trial, if it gets there, longer. He exhaled. This doesn't end today. Today we just make sure it can't be stopped. Miles nodded. He understood that. He'd understood somewhere in the past 7 weeks that the goal had never been a clean resolution. It had been making the truth too visible and too distributed to suppress. Today had accomplished that. Everything after today was process, and process took time, and that was how it was. Celeste, Miles said. How is she doing? Nathan was quiet for a moment. She's doing what she does. She's working. A pause. She cried once, briefly, in the room before the federal people arrived. She stopped before anyone else saw it. Then she went back to work. He said it with something in his voice that was not quite pride and not quite sorrow, but held both. She's her mother's daughter. When does she get to just... Miles stopped. He wasn't sure how to finish it. Be angry at me? Nathan said. Something like that. Later. After this. There'll be time for all of it later. He looked at the wall across the hallway, at nothing specific. I know I owe her more than I can give her. 3 years is... It's not something you give back. I can explain the reasons, and they're real reasons. It doesn't give the time back. Miles thought about his daughter, about the 3 years since the marriage ended, about the evenings he'd missed and the things he'd tried to compensate for with presence and attention, and soup, brought to a garage in an industrial lot, as if acts of care could reroute time. They couldn't. You couldn't reroute time. You could only show up consistently in the time that was left. She knows you're alive, Miles said. That's a different problem than the one she had this morning. Nathan looked at him. That's a remarkably practical way to look at it. I'm a practical person. Yes, Nathan said. You are. That's what saved us, more than anything else. He paused. The photograph. The coordinates. I'd left them there for 2 years. 3 people drove that car before you. None of them found it. They weren't lying on their back in the passenger footwell fixing a heat shield. No, they weren't. Celeste found Miles at 3:15. She came out of the conference room with her jacket still on, but something released in her posture. The particular decompression of a person whose immediate crisis has moved from acute to managed. She stood in front of Miles's chair, and he started to stand, and she said, "Don't," with a quick gesture, so he settled back. She sat in the chair Nathan had vacated 2 hours ago. They sat for a moment without speaking. The hallway was quieter now. Most of the personnel had moved into various rooms, and what remained was the ambient sound of a building processing an unprecedented afternoon. The merger is dead, she said. The Hargrove representatives have already been in contact with their own board. Whatever they were part of, knowingly or otherwise, they're trying to get in front of it. She said it without satisfaction. That'll be a legal question for a while. What happens to the company? We restructure. Under genuine governance this time. She looked at her hands. There's going to be a period where a lot of people are very uncertain about their jobs and the company's future, and that's my problem to manage. A pause. 14,000 people work for this company. I know. I keep thinking about that. She looked at him sideways. Not the look she used professionally, something less composed. My father told me you knew for 7 weeks, that you kept driving me every day for 7 weeks. I didn't know what the right move was. You made the right move. Eventually. Eventually is enough. She was quiet for a moment. They hurt you this morning. Damien's people. I've already been through this conversation. I know. I'm going to be repeating it for a while, probably. She put her hands on her knees. What do you need? Right now, today. What do you need? Miles thought about it seriously, the way he thought about things that deserved serious thought. His ribs needed ice and rest, and probably better pain management than the 2 ibuprofen he'd taken from someone's desk at noon. He needed to call Sophie's mother and tell her something approximating the truth. He needed to call Sophie herself, because he'd promised her before all of this started that he would call every other day, and he'd missed yesterday. I need to make a phone call, he said. Celeste nodded. She didn't ask who he needed to call. After that? After that, I need to sit here for another hour while my ribs stop arguing with me. And after that? Miles looked at the window at the end of the hallway, at the late afternoon sky that was doing the thing it did at this time of year, going a particular shade of gray-orange at the horizon that existed only in November and only for about 40 minutes before the dark came in behind it. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. Celeste nodded again. There was something in the nod that wasn't her professional manner and wasn't the fractured version of the morning. Something quieter, something that belonged to a person rather than a CEO. "My father talks about you," she said. "In the meeting, when he was explaining the sequence of events to the federal team, he talks about you the way—" She stopped, found the words. "The way people talk about someone they trust, not the way employers talk about good employees. Something different." Miles didn't know what to do with that, so he let it sit. "He doesn't trust easily," she said. "He didn't used to. I don't know if 3 years alone changes that." She stood, smoothed her jacket. The CEO, returning from a brief expedition into being human. The car at the garage. The Lincoln he was restoring. "I want it brought here when the evidence team is done with it." "Both of them?" She paused. "There are two?" "The one he hid the documents in, Webb. Your car. And the one he spent a year restoring. Same year, same model. He started working on it with his hands because he needed something to do in the dark." Celeste absorbed this. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to manage or contain. Just let it move through. "Yes," she said. "Both of them." She went back into the conference room. Miles sat in the hallway for another hour, as he'd said he would, and watched the November light do its 40 minutes of honesty at the horizon, and listened to his ribs lodge their ongoing complaint, and thought about a man alone in a garage putting a broken thing back together piece by piece in the dark, and what that meant, and what it cost, and what it was worth in the end. He called Sophie at 4 o'clock. She told him about a book she was reading. He listened with complete attention. She asked if he was okay because he sounded different, and he said he was fine, just a long day, and she said okay. And they talked for 23 minutes about nothing that mattered and everything that did. And when he hung up, the hallway felt less like the 34th floor of a corporation in the middle of a federal investigation, and more like just a hallway. He sat there until his ribs settled into something manageable, and the light outside went from gray-orange to dark, and the building shifted around him into its evening mode, quieter and more honest than it was during the day. In the conference room, through the closed door, he could hear voices. His, hers, the federal teams, the lawyers. The sound of a reckoning in progress, which is not a clean sound and not a satisfying sound, but is the only sound that reckoning actually makes in real life. People talking, slowly, through the weight of things that happened and the harder weight of what comes next. Miles closed his eyes. He breathed around his ribs. Outside on the 34th floor, the city continued its indifferent and necessary work. The federal trial of Damian Cross and Elaine Mercer began 7 months after the morning in the garage, and it lasted 11 weeks. And it was not the clean cinematic reckoning that people who'd followed the story in the news had perhaps imagined it would be. Trials rarely are. They are procedural and repetitive and frequently technical, and the emotional core of what happened. A man hidden away for 3 years, a daughter grieving a father who was still alive, a driver beaten against a concrete pillar for refusing to say a name, gets compressed into evidentiary language that strips it of the texture it had when it was happening. Miles sat in the gallery on 4 separate days when his testimony was relevant and watched lawyers move carefully through the architecture of what he'd lived through, and found the experience deeply strange, the way it's strange to see a photograph of a place you love taken from an angle that makes it look like somewhere else. He told the truth. All of it, in the order it had happened, including the parts that didn't make him look particularly decisive or brave, the 4 days he'd waited before driving to the coordinates, the 7 weeks he'd managed information instead of going directly to authorities, the calculation he'd made about his daughter when Damian said her name in the front seat of the Lincoln. The prosecutor had asked him why he hadn't contacted federal investigators sooner, and Miles had said, honestly, that he hadn't been sure they were safe to contact, given what Nathan had told him about the scope of the operation and which institutional channels Damian's network might have compromised. The prosecutor nodded. The defense, when its turn came, suggested that Miles had withheld information for personal reasons, possibly financial ones. Miles said he had not received any money. The defense asked if he'd been offered any. Miles said yes. The defense asked how much. Miles said he hadn't let them get to a specific number because he'd already decided he wasn't going to take it, and the room had been quiet for a moment in a way that made the court reporter look up briefly from her machine. Damian Cross's defense was technical and expensive and argued process violations at every turn. He was convicted on 6 counts. He stood and received the verdict with the same contained composure he'd brought to every other moment Miles had observed him in, which was, in its way, the most honest thing about him. He was exactly what he'd always been, right to the end of it. Elaine Mercer wept during her verdict. Miles had not expected that. He'd built a picture of Elaine in his mind over the months, and it hadn't included weeping, which probably said something about his tendency to reduce people he hadn't met to their function in a story. She received 4 counts. Her attorney immediately announced appeal intentions. That was, Nathan told Miles later, going to take years. Some things end and then keep going for a long time before they're actually finished. Nathan did not return to Ashcroft Global. He'd made this decision before the morning in the garage, or possibly during the 3 years before it, and he announced it publicly 6 weeks after that morning in a statement that Celeste read on his behalf because Nathan himself had declined all media contact. The statement was short. It said that Nathan Ashcroft accepted responsibility for creating conditions within his company that had allowed criminal behavior to flourish under his leadership. It said he was grateful to be alive, and that he did not consider himself a hero of the events that had occurred, but rather a person who had survived the consequences of his own failures and been given, by luck and by the specific decency of one particular person, a chance to be honest about them. It said he would not be returning to the company and that he believed the company was in capable hands. Miles read the statement when it ran in the business press. He thought it was honest in the way that things are honest when the person delivering them has had a long time to decide what honesty actually requires. He thought it was probably harder to write than it looked, and he thought about Nathan at the workbench in the garage with the battery-powered lamp, turning the words over in his mind the way he turned over everything, slowly, from multiple angles, until they were as accurate as he could make them. He called Nathan that night. "Did you write it yourself?" Miles asked. "Every word," Nathan said. "Celeste wanted to soften a few things. I didn't let her." "Good." A pause. "You were in it. The original draft. I took it out because you've been clear about not wanting that kind of attention. I appreciate that. You saved my life, Miles. You left very specific instructions in a car. I left instructions in a car for 2 years and nobody followed them." Nathan's voice was dry. "You happened to be lying in the footwell." "Faulty heat shield," Miles said. "Yes." They were quiet for a moment. The comfortable quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and no longer needed to narrate it constantly to believe it had happened. "What are you doing with yourself?" Nathan asked. Miles looked around his apartment. The kitchen table where he'd first sat with the photograph. The nightstand where his phone had lit up at 5:47 in the morning. The window that showed the same view it had always shown, a strip of street and a portion of another building and a reliable portion of sky, which was doing nothing special tonight. "I've been looking at a space," Miles said. "What kind of space?" "Commercial, ground floor, about 3 miles from here. It's been empty for a while, so the price is manageable." He paused. "It has 3 bays." Nathan said nothing for a moment. "You're reopening the shop." "I'm thinking about it." "What's stopping you?" Miles had spent a month with the question. The practical answers were real: capital, the startup costs of equipment, the customer base he'd have to rebuild from nothing, the specific uncertainty of being 43 and starting over in a business he'd already started and lost once. All of it was real, and all of it had weight. But the actual answer, the one underneath the practical ones, was simpler and harder. He'd closed the shop 6 years ago because of capital issues, yes, and because the marriage was ending and the math didn't work, and because the responsible choice at the time had been a steadier income and benefits and a clear schedule. He'd made the responsible choice, and he'd been good at the work he'd exchanged it for, and he'd built a life that functioned. And somewhere in the functioning, he'd stopped thinking of the shop as a place he was going back to and started thinking of it as a place that had existed, past tense, like a country you'd lived in before a movie. The garage had done something to that. Spending time in a space where a man had quietly, without audience or urgency, restored a broken car over a year because it was the work he knew, and the work gave shape to days that would otherwise have been purely about waiting, that had done something to how Miles thought about his own past tense. I'll let you know when I decide, Miles said. I already know what you're going to decide, Nathan said. You've known for a while, too. Miles didn't argue with that. Well, the compensation fund Celeste established for victims of the criminal network took 18 months to fully operationalize, and it eventually reached people across 3 countries and multiple industries who had been on the receiving end of operations that the public accounting of the trial had only partially surfaced. Celeste drove that process personally, with the focused relentlessness that was her primary quality, and Miles watched it from a distance and thought that she was probably the right person to be doing it, not because she was the best possible person in some abstract sense, but because she was the person who was there, with the resources and the access and the specific guilt of someone who'd signed things she shouldn't have signed and was going to spend a long time working out what she owed for that. She told Miles, in a conversation 3 months after the trial, that she still didn't know how to hold both things at once, her father's survival and the years she'd spent without him. I keep thinking I should feel one thing, she said, either grateful he's alive or angry about the time. But it's both, always at the same time, and I don't know how to resolve it. Maybe you don't resolve it, Miles said. Maybe you just carry it until it gets lighter. She'd looked at him. That's not a particularly satisfying answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She'd gone back to work. That was what she did. Miles respected it, even when he thought she was using work as a way of deferring the emotional processing that was waiting for her regardless. He wasn't her therapist. He wasn't her father. I wasn't really, by any formal definition, anything to her anymore. The job had ended the day the garage happened, because driving someone to meetings loses its professional shape once you've been beaten up in front of them and their long-dead father walked out of a car and changed everyone's morning. She'd offered him a position, Senior Security Liaison, a title that Miles suspected had been created specifically because no existing title fit what he'd actually done. The salary was considerable. The discomfort he felt looking at the offer letter was also considerable. He'd taken 2 weeks to give her an answer, and the answer was no, delivered in person in her office, directly, without excessive explanation. She'd taken it well. Celeste Ashcroft took most things well when they were delivered directly and without drama. The shop, she said. It wasn't a question. The shop, he confirmed. I'll send you my car. He'd started to say that wasn't necessary, and she'd held up a hand. The Lincoln. For restoration work. Not as payment. I don't want you to think of it as payment. I want it restored properly, and I want someone who knows what they're doing to do it. A pause. And I want my father to have somewhere to go. Miles had understood what she was saying. Nathan, in the months since the trial, had been occupying the specific uncomfortable territory of a man who had been returned to the world but didn't yet know where in it he belonged. He wasn't going back to the company. He'd declined every invitation to re-enter the public life he'd had before. I was living in a rented house outside the city, and by all accounts, struggling with the particular challenge of a man who'd spent 3 years organizing himself entirely around survival, and now had to figure out what came after survival. He needed something to do with his hands. Miles understood that better than most people. Send me the car, Miles said. He signed the lease on the shop space on a Tuesday in April, which was exactly 14 months after the morning in the garage. He did it alone, at the realtor's office, with a pen that had a chewed cap. And the papers went into a folder, and the folder went into his bag, and he drove to pick up Sophie from school, because it was his week. And she came out of the building arguing with a friend about something that they'd resolved by the time they reached the car, and forgotten entirely by the time they got home. She sat at his kitchen table and did homework while he made dinner, and the normalcy of it, the specific, unspectacular normalcy of a child doing homework while a parent made pasta, felt like the most valuable thing in his life, and had felt that way for some time. Dad, she said without looking up from her notebook. Yeah. Are you opening a new garage? He told her carefully, the version of events appropriate for an 11-year-old, that he'd helped someone who needed help, that there had been some complicated parts, that it was over now. She'd accepted this with the pragmatic trust of a child who has learned that adults sometimes simplify things, and that some of the simplifications are okay. I am, he said. She looked up. She had her mother's eyes and his tendency to absorb information before responding, and the combination of these two things meant her face was often doing something considered even when she appeared to be doing nothing. Is it going to be like the old one? Smaller, maybe. Same kind of work. You were happier when you had the other one, she said, and went back to her homework. Miles stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in his hand and thought about how clearly children see things that adults spend enormous energy obscuring from themselves. Yeah, he said. I was. Nathan showed up at the shop for the first time on a Thursday in late May, 3 weeks after Miles had gotten the space functional enough to actually work in. He came without calling, which Miles had learned to expect. Nathan had never adapted to the convention of announcing himself, possibly because 3 years of operating without a phone had restructured his relationship to it. He drove up in an ordinary car, a modest sedan that bore no relationship to the vehicles he'd once been associated with, and stood in the open bay door for a moment looking at the space. It was still rough. The equipment was second-hand and showed it. The floor had been cleaned but not resurfaced. One of the bay doors had a spring issue that Miles was addressing incrementally. Against the far wall, on a set of heavy-duty stands, sat Celeste's Lincoln, stripped to its essentials, surfaces exposed, waiting. Good bones, Nathan said. It's always had good bones. Miles was on a creeper under a different car, a 1969 Chevelle, belonging to a customer who'd heard about the shop through a restoration forum online. He rolled out and sat up. You could have called. I thought about it. Nathan looked at the Lincoln. He walked toward it slowly. His hands went to the passenger side door frame, and he ran them along the metal with the particular attention of someone touching something they haven't touched in a long time. How far along? Mechanicals are solid. The bodywork is going to take a while. I want to do the interior last. Nathan nodded. He wasn't looking at Miles. He was looking at the car the way people look at something that represents more than itself. I drove this car the first time I visited the shop my father ran. Not this specific car. One like it. He used to say that a Lincoln drove like an argument no one could win. I never knew exactly what he meant by that. What do you think he meant? I think he meant it had a confidence that wasn't about speed. It just went where it was going and didn't apologize for the weight it was carrying. Nathan put his hands in his pockets, looked at Miles. I may have found a meaning that wasn't in the original. Miles stood up from the creeper. He wiped his hands on a shop rag that was already past its best days. You need somewhere to be in the mornings, he said. Not a question. Nathan looked around the shop, at the tools, the cars, the unfinished floor, the bay door with its spring issue, the general productive disorder of a working space that was still becoming itself. I'm not going to be much use for a while. I know how to do some things. I know how to restore interiors. I know more about the mechanical side than most people would guess. But I'll be slow. That's fine. I don't want to be paid. I'm aware of how I'm situated financially. I wasn't going to pay you. Nathan almost smiled, the full version of the smile that had been approaching and retreating across the whole time Miles had known him. Your people skills are not your strongest attribute, Miles. My ex-wife would agree with you. And yet, Miles agreed. Nathan came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. And then, without either of them formally acknowledging it, he started coming on Tuesdays as well. And by July, he was there 4 days a week, working on the Lincoln's interior with a methodical patience that Miles found he could match his own rhythm to without discussion. They didn't talk constantly. That was the thing that made it work. Two people who were both comfortable with silence, working on adjacent problems in the same space, occasionally consulting each other and occasionally not. Nathan knew things about the Lincoln that Miles didn't. Specific details about the original interior specifications, the particular grade of leather that had been used, where to source replacement chrome trim that matched rather than approximated. Miles knew things about the mechanical restoration that Nathan deferred to entirely. They occupied their respective competencies without ego, which was rare enough between two people that Miles noticed it consciously and appreciated it. Sophie came to the shop one Saturday and sat on a stool and did homework while Miles worked and Nathan worked. And at some point, Nathan had explained something about what he was doing to the interior panel he was treating, and Sophie had asked 3 questions that were more precise than most adults would have asked, and Nathan had answered them with the same directness he brought to everything. On the way home, Sophie said, "Is that the man from the garage?" Miles considered his answer. Yes. She nodded. He's okay, she said, in the tone of an 11-year-old confirming a judgment she'd been forming. He talks to me like I'm a person. He does that. Some adults talk to kids like we're furniture that might break. Some adults talk to everybody like that, Miles said. Sophie thought about this. That's true, she said, and looked out the window. The Lincoln was finished in October. Not perfectly finished. There are no perfectly finished restorations, only restorations that have reached the point where the remaining imperfections are the honest kind, the kind that belong to the car's age and history, rather than to negligence or insufficient care. Miles would have told you the car was done. Nathan would have identified 4 things he still wanted to do differently. They'd had the conversation, and Miles had told him that at some point a car was either driven or it was a museum piece, and Nathan had said that wasn't wrong, but he still didn't like the interior panel on the passenger side rear door, and Miles had said that was fine. Nathan could address it while Miles worked on the Chevelle, and Nathan had. Celeste came to see it on a Saturday in mid-October. She stood in the shop doorway the way her father had stood there the first time, looking at the space and at the car, and something in her face did the thing it sometimes did, the fractured quality returning briefly and then being put away again. She walked around the car twice. She opened the driver's door and looked at the interior and closed it carefully. She crouched and looked at the rocker panels and stood and looked at the hood line and was quiet for a long time. It looks like it did when I was 12, she said, when he used to drive me to school in it. Neither Miles nor Nathan said anything. Some statements don't need a response. They just need to be heard. She straightened up. She looked at her father. The two of them had been navigating their way toward each other for 10 months with the specific difficulty of people who love each other and have a large, unresolved thing between them, and are doing it anyway, imperfectly, because the alternative is not doing it, and that's worse. They hadn't resolved it. You don't resolve things like that. You find ways to keep going alongside them. Take it for a drive, she said to Nathan. She looked at Miles. Both of you. Miles drove first, because Nathan said he wanted to sit in the passenger seat and look at the interior panel on the rear door from this angle. Miles suspected this was also because Nathan wanted someone else behind the wheel for the first few miles, to be in the car before being responsible for it, and didn't want to say that directly. They went out of the city on the old highway that ran north, the one that preceded the interstate and still existed in that particular state of secondary roads, less trafficked, less maintained in certain stretches, more honest about the landscape it passed through. The Lincoln moved the way Lincolns of that era moved, with a weight that was not sluggish but deliberate, like a large animal that knows it doesn't need to hurry. Nathan was quiet for the first several miles. He looked out the window and occasionally looked at the interior panel he was dissatisfied with, and looked out the window again. The afternoon light was the October kind, the kind that comes in at a low angle and makes ordinary things look specific. My father had a saying, Nathan said eventually. He ran the original shop, the one whose name was on the building. He used to say that the difference between a car that runs and a car that's alive is someone caring about it consistently over time. Sounds like something that applies to more than cars, Miles said. He was that kind of person. Everything applied to more than the immediate thing. Nathan looked at the road. I didn't appreciate it when I was young. I thought it was folksy. Then I spent 35 years building a company and started to understand that the people who seem folksy are often just people who figured something out before everyone else did. Miles said nothing. The road went through a stretch of open land, fields going gold and brown with October, and the Lincoln moved through it with the particular confidence Nathan had described, not apologizing for the space it occupied. Nathan. Yes. Pull over up here, past the tree line. Nathan looked ahead. There was a gravel pull-off about a quarter-mile up, the kind of roadside space that exists for no formal reason, except that enough people have pulled off there over enough years that it's become a space for that purpose. Miles pulled in and stopped. He got out of the car, walked around to the passenger side, opened the door. Your turn, he said. Nathan looked at him. Then he got out of the car and got behind the wheel and sat in the driver's seat of the Lincoln for a moment with his hands in his lap, not on the wheel. Miles got in the passenger side, closed the door. Nathan put his hands on the wheel. He didn't start the car. He just sat with his hands on it and looked through the windshield at the gravel and the field beyond and the late afternoon horizon. 3 years, he said. Not dramatic, just a number that needed to be said out loud. 3 years, Miles agreed. I used to think about what I'd do when it was over. I had a lot of time to think. I made lists in my head. Things I'd do, things I'd say, things I owed people. He looked at the horizon. The lists seem less useful now than they did then. Some things you can plan, and some things you just have to be in. That's not the worst thing to learn. It's a slow lesson for a man my age. He started the car. The engine turned over with the sound it had made in the garage that morning 10 months ago. The rough catch finding its idle, the V8 settling into its role. I don't know if the company will survive. The restructuring is complicated. She's doing what she does, but it's a lot. Some things can't be fixed by working harder. She knows that. She does. She just doesn't know what to do instead of working harder yet. He eased the Lincoln out of the gravel and back onto the road. That'll come. They drove for another 20 minutes in the direction of open horizon, the road doing what roads eventually do, curving toward the thing it was always heading for. The light dropped by degrees, the day going honest the way it goes honest at its edges. Not with drama, just with the gradual removal of the middle-of-the-day pretense that things are simpler than they are. At some point a car passed them going the other direction, and the driver, a man, older, country kind of old car driver, lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the specific salute that people who drive old cars exchange with each other, the acknowledgement of a shared sensibility. Nathan returned it without thinking. Miles noticed. Didn't say anything. If you'd asked Miles Rowan at any point in the 3 years before all of this, what he thought he was for, what his life, in its honest assessment, amounted to, he would have given you a practical answer. He took care of his daughter. He did his job well. He got through the days without causing unnecessary harm to the people around him. These were not small things. He had never thought they were small things. But they were also not the stuff of anything a person would call a story. He'd spent 8 months being invisible in someone else's world. Then a tracking device and a photograph and a set of coordinates had handed him something he hadn't asked for and couldn't put back down. And he'd carried it through 7 weeks of ordinary days and 1 very long morning and 11 weeks of trial testimony and 14 months of rebuilding a shop from near nothing. And here he was in the passenger seat of a restored Lincoln on an October highway with the man whose life had ridden inside that car for 3 years. He thought about what it cost. The cracked ribs that still, in cold weather, made themselves known in a low, persistent way that he'd been told might be permanent. The weeks his daughter had been kept close at home without explanation. The 6 or 7 genuinely frightening moments he hadn't fully processed until weeks after they'd passed, when the body finally released what it had been holding. He thought about what it was worth, not in the transactional way, not the calculation of cost against outcome, but the thing itself, the quality of it, the specific value of having been the person who found what was hidden in a car because he was lying in the footwell fixing a heat shield that anyone else would have sent out. You don't get to choose what you're handed. You only get to choose what you do with it. Miles Rowan had been handed a photograph and a set of coordinates and a piece of paper that said he didn't die. Hurry. And he'd taken his time, careful as always, 6 angles at once, and he'd done what it asked. There was no version of that he would undo. Beside him, Nathan was driving the Lincoln toward the last of the October light, with his hands relaxed on the wheel and his window cracked 2 inches, the way he preferred it, and the air coming in had that specific smell. Cut fields, distance, something on its way to cold. That doesn't exist in cities, and exists very fully in the spaces between them. A reporter had called Miles the previous month, working on a retrospective piece about the trial. She'd asked him the question that apparently everyone wanted answered. How does an ordinary chauffeur bring down a billion-dollar empire? She'd asked. Miles had thought about it for a moment. He'd thought about the heat shield, the photograph, the cold soup he'd bought at a gas station and brought to a man who was eating things from cans, the 17 minutes Celeste had made in 20, Nathan's hands on the bay door chain, the cracked ribs filing their cold weather complaints. He doesn't, Miles had said. He just doesn't look away when he finds something. Most people look away. That's all. The reporter had written something else. Something more satisfying for her readers, probably. That was fine. The real answer was true whether or not it appeared in print. Miles watched the highway go by and listened to the Lincoln carry them and thought about the shop waiting for them back in the city. The Chevelle still on the lift, the spring issue on the bay door, the second-hand equipment that worked well enough, the particular productive disorder of a space that was becoming itself. He'd been happier when he had the other one. Sophie had said it simply, and she'd been right. He was happier now. Not because everything had resolved cleanly. It hadn't. It doesn't. The trial had generated appeals that would run for years, and the compensation fund had uncovered losses that no amount of money would fully address. And Celeste was still working too hard, and Nathan still sometimes went quiet in a way that was about 3 years and not about the car. Not because the ribs didn't hurt in cold weather, not because being 43 and starting a business from scratch was anything other than exactly as uncertain as it sounded, but because the work was the right work and the space was the right space, and the person beside him was someone he'd walked into a situation with and walked out of the other side alongside. And that counted for something that Miles didn't have a cleaner word for than what it was. The Lincoln moved down the highway toward the last of the light, carrying nothing hidden this time, carrying nothing other than 2 men going somewhere and coming back. That was enough. That was, in the end, the whole of it.